Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, Kim Hunter-Reid, Commissioner of Higher Education. Really excited to welcome all of you to the Higher Education Climate Action Listening Session 1. We are very interested as a task force in making sure over the next year that we collect information and really dig deep into these conversations with our stakeholders about the importance of this work and think about all that higher education can do when it comes to climate action with our colleges and universities, our faculty, our students, all of our stakeholders. So we're very happy that you all have joined us today for listening session 1. And I'm delighted to turn it over to our co-chair, Millie Garcia, to say a few words as well. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Kim. Good afternoon, buenas tardes. Today, we have a treat for you. We have a great panel to help us understand why higher education should accelerate climate change. We are joined by Dr. Spencer Glendon and Dr. Elsa Nunez, as well as Ayana Albertini-Fleurant and Dr. Leah Stokes. We will hear from each panelist first, and then the commissioners will be able to ask questions. So, Kim?
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you. And thank you to the task force, to the public that's watching online for joining us here today. So let's get started. We will begin with Dr. Spencer Glendon. Each panelist will provide about 5 minutes of initial remarks, and then we'll have a conversation after as well. So Dr. Glendon will focus on the need to recognize the loss of climate stability and the urgency of action to determine a range of probable futures. And so we're delighted to welcome you, Dr. Glendon, as panelist number 1.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Can I get a thumbs up from somebody? Right on. Thank you. All right. So I am going to share my screen, and your screen should turn purple. Did it turn purple? All right. I got more thumbs up. Let's get started. So I'm going to start with a question. This is a forward-looking panel thinking about the future, but I'm actually going to start with a backward-looking question, which is, why did it take so long to create the modern university? Why did it take so long to have there be higher education? Because it really did take a long time. The first human beings like you and I started walking around in Africa 200,000 years ago, and for 190,000 years, they didn't build permanent structures. They didn't build towns. They didn't build communities. They moved around. They're just like you and I. For some reason, they didn't do that. And then starting about 9,500 BCE were the first known human settlements. And even from there, it took them 11,000 years in the Middle East and Africa to build scholarly institutions for the first time. That's a long time. Over time, universities became part of wealthy life in big cities, in places of centers of wealth and power. Eventually, we got the Morrill Act in 1862 in this country to create land-grant universities to aid U.S. industrialization. Now, this history matters because what it tells us is that first you need communities, and they then build cultures. Those cultures are codified and built into institutions like governments, which create infrastructure. That infrastructure is both physical and rules, laws, systems. That then allows for enrichment into forms of industry, and eventually you get higher education. There's really no place where this pattern didn't happen in this order. But you might be wondering, why didn't humans settle until 9,500 BCE? And when I was in school as a boy, I learned that this had happened. There had been settlement, but nobody knew why. It was a mystery. But climate science tells us the answer, which was that from 200,000 BCE until 10,000 BCE, the climate was unstable. This is a graph of the average temperature of the Earth's atmosphere. What you see is our earliest ancestors were born into a very volatile period. Temperature swung wildly, and people moved rationally, following their prey, following the plants, following the nice weather. But then in 9,500 BCE, things stabilized and stayed stable. And that allowed people to anticipate the weather. The past weather was like the future weather. We even used language that says, Baton Rouge is hot. And what we mean is it was hot, it is hot now, will always be hot. That is called the habitual present tense. Little grammar there for the higher ed folks. So what we now know is that a stable climate is actually what underpins all of civilization. A stable climate enabled communities to be able to plan. And then prosperity allowed them to build higher education. And that civilization had a climate that wasn't just stable, it was perfect for us. Human bodies, all of us have the same body temperature, and at the same high temperature of heat and humidity, it's no good for us. Our bodies fail. Plus, there were stable seasonal patterns. And so what I'm going to show you now is data from an initiative that I founded to bring what was already theoretically public data into the public sphere so people could use it in the form of maps. And here's a map of how many days were above what's called 32 degrees C or 90 degrees Fahrenheit wet bulb. So that's 90 degrees and 100% humidity, or 104 degrees and 55% humidity. This is a temperature at which is very unhealthy for the human body to do pretty much anything. What you see is that this map has no data on it. 0.5 degrees C, which is the late 20th century, between 1971 and 2000, this really didn't happen. There's actually a little bit of green in the Persian Gulf. There are a couple of places where once in a very great while this would happen, but this temperature, nobody was exposed to it on Earth. So we now know it can be too hot for humans, and it can be too unstable for civilization. And there really are three periods: too hot for humans, too unstable for civilization, and this long green band of civilization that we lived in. And the reason we're having this meeting today is we are now outside the green band for the first time in civilization's history. At 1.2 degrees C, it is warmer than it's ever been since we were civilized, and it's more unstable. So it's harder to plan. And so climate change isn't just about warmer temperatures, it's about instability, about the difficulty of knowing what's coming. But the good news is climate science can help us know what's coming, help us plan. And so honoring the secretary, I'm going to go right to Baton Rouge. I'm going to go to the weather outside her office and look up close. You can click on any cell in the around the world and see at 0.5 in the late 20th century, during many of our childhoods, this is what the temperature was like in Baton Rouge. On an average year, there'd be 3 days where it was hotter than 28 wet bulb or 82 wet bulb. So that's 82 degrees and 100% humidity, or 86 degrees and 85% humidity, or 100 degrees and 45% humidity. These are days when it's hard to be outside. You shouldn't work outside, kids shouldn't play outside. But what you see is a range. In some years, cool years, it wouldn't happen at all. In warm years, it might be 3 weeks. And in an average year, it would happen a few days. So what has already happened in Louisiana and everywhere else around the world is those ranges have shifted. That's what climate change is, the shifting of those ranges. So you see that purple caret at the top of the screen that indicates 0.5. I'm now going to make it move to 1 degree C. And you see what happens in Baton Rouge. We'll go back, I'll show you again. Go from 0.5 to 1, and it goes from now, still might not happen, but it might be more than a month. And it's 6 days on average. If you go to 1.5, which is pretty soon, it's a different climate. It's a different set of circumstances. And those matter for the human body, for infrastructure, for all the things that people in higher ed have to think about. If you go higher to 2 degrees C, it really is very different, not only in Baton Rouge, but everywhere else. And so that gives you a sense of how that instability likely affects all of the things I just built that tower on. Climate instability affects communities, cultures, government, infrastructure. Our buildings aren't built for the right things. Our customs aren't not quite right. So thankfully, we can understand what's happening, and we can use the insights of climate science to strengthen institutions, to strengthen higher ed, to strengthen society, so we can be resilient to these changes. So what we're in the practice of, I put metaphorically, is tying all these things together, these things that we thought of as stable, making them be connected and stable. So even if you're not decreasing carbon, but you're making culture, government, infrastructure more resilient, you're helping deal with climate change for society. And so these are examples of climate questions that I think are important for education. Should climate change be taught along with government or politics, not just in a science curriculum? Can we incorporate climate data into math class? Should we postpone tests after hot nights? These are not, you don't need to invent fusion to be able to help with climate change. These are ways our institutions can adapt. And physically, are we using climate science and we choose the grade of asphalt? Should we think about when summer vacation happens? And so I just want to get things started. I was asked to get the juices flowing, but also ground us in a way that could help the rest of the conversation. And I hope I did that.
You did indeed. Thank you so much, Dr. Glendon. You're right, Baton Rouge is hot, and we do want a stable climate. That is for sure. So I appreciate you bringing it all the way home to me in Louisiana. Thank you very much.
I happen to love Louisiana, so it was an easy thing to do.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Of course, we can't talk about this work and how we mobilize higher education this work without thinking about the role of university presidents. So we're excited to have Dr. Nunez with us to provide the perspective of a university president, how institution-wide change thinking about mitigation, adaptation, education, and equity is happening on a college campus, and certainly more broadly, what's the call to action for institutional presidents, and what should they be thinking about in this sector? So Dr. Nunez, I'll turn it over to you as panelist number 2. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Kim. I'm going to turn on my timer first because they told me 5 minutes and I want to make sure that I am on time. At Spencer, that was actually very, very motivating to hear you talk and tying the pieces together. Thank you for that. I came to Eastern 18 years ago. And at Eastern, there was an Institute of Sustainable Energy at that time. And the staff and the students working as interns in the municipalities were doing excellent work. And that work was focused on building assessments. They were doing building audits. And the focus was, can we save money by making sure that we're energy efficient? And that was the way the work was done. So my first 2 years, I was pretty impressed with that. And then all of a sudden, I started to hear the students talking about climate and climate action. And they were speaking about it differently than the faculty, staff, and the way I was speaking about it. And what they saw, that this work about money, saving money, was interesting, but that was not what was at the heart of it. They were actually quite inspiring to me. They said, we need to reverse the long-standing practices of waste in this society. And the students wanted to change the way people lived, to Spencer's point. And that really became an inspiration to me as president to create 3 pillars at Eastern. I call them pillars, they're areas. The first pillar is the academic area. And so we have a major in sustainability, a very strong major led by the faculty, very, highly credentialed faculty. But to Spencer's point, they went a step further and they have now added climate courses and sustainability courses across the curriculum. So it's in sociology, it's in political science, it's across the curriculum. And they've added the equity lens to climate. And that has really, really inspired many faculty, other faculty and students to do this work. So we're at a place now where the curriculum is deep and wide in terms of climate action with an equity lens. The second pillar is the outreach pillar, the community pillar. I mentioned that earlier, but it's changed. Now there's an education component. So what do? We train the leaders of the municipalities on climate action. The lower level workers, we provide climate action workshops for them that they can find useful in their day-to-day lives. And we have developed a K-12 curriculum for the schools, which has been very, very useful in terms of community outreach. The third pillar is what we do on campus, and we have a Green Campus Committee. That Green Campus Committee's main charge is to make sure that I do what's in the action plan and that we do what's in the action plan. It's easy to develop an action plan and put it on a shelf and then nobody monitors it. So there's accountability built into the action plan. So in 2007, I was one of the presidents. Eastern was one of the 100 institutions to sign the American College University President's Climate Commitment. I was slow to sign it because I didn't think I had enough money to do what was in the plan. And I was very slow to sign something if I couldn't put my heart and soul into it and also back it with financial, the financial underpinnings. We did that. We did a financial analysis, and thus was born our first climate action plan. It was a 10-year plan. It was developed by faculty, staff, and students. And that's why the 3 pillars work, because the action plan speaks to the 3 pillars. After that plan was completed, we have now embarked on our second 10-year plan, and that has 11 strategic initiatives, from achieving carbon neutrality to making sure that climate literacy is in the curriculum. And I talked a little bit about that earlier. So what has that given us? That's given us in the Princeton Review 11 years consecutively. We're a green college. Fantastic for recruitment. I'm recruiting the right kinds of students to Eastern because they see us in the Princeton Review. In December 22, we got the first gold rating in stars, and everybody went crazy on campus. We had a big party. We had worked my entire 18 years towards that, but it was because of the Green Campus Committee that kept monitoring our progress that we were able to do that. That's all at the micro level, the campus level, the state level. At the national level and the macro level, I got involved with Second Nature. Fantastic organization. I was first on the steering committee, then on the board of directors, and they provide the oversight for the Second Nature's Climate Leadership Network. That's like gold because you have all the college presidents involved. There's an annual conference. I take a team of people to the annual conference, and I learned so much. So what this has given me is an opportunity to learn as a president about climate and to be able to provide the leadership without depending on other people to speak for me, because I'm learning from the network what other campuses are doing, what higher education is doing. So to the question about what should higher education do to accelerate action, I think Eastern on the state level is doing that. And I think the network is doing that and should do even more at the national level.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I appreciate the collaborative plan, the action of the plan, accountability of the plan, and leadership matters, right? You wanted to make sure you could drive home the work and that you're sustaining the work. So celebration for you. I think this is a great transition to panelist 3 because Dr. Nunez mentioned how the students centered this conversation and thought about it differently. So we're very happy to have a recent graduate with us, Ayana Albertini-Fleurant, who is going to give the perspective of a recent graduate of what solutions she was able to access in higher ed and the importance of higher ed's connection to community and certainly, I'm sure, student voice as well. So thank you for joining us, panelist 3.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ayana. I use she, her pronouns. I am the founder of an organization called Sustain the Culture, but I'm also honored to be the first graduate of Howard University's Environmental Studies program. So today I just want to share about my experience as an HBCU graduate and provide insights into the unique role that HBCUs have in climate action. So I hope that this perspective helps the task force shape recommendations specifically for minority serving institutions around the country. So during the civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s, HBCUs served as critical hubs of activism and organizing. Students from these institutions were very instrumental in shaping that movement's direction, and many of them went on to become prominent civil rights leaders. But in addition to student-led activism, HBCU administrators and faculty also played a vital role in advocating for social change, using their positions to challenge injustice both on and off campus. So this rich history of HBCUs as catalysts for social change provides a solid foundation upon which these institutions can continue to drive climate action today. As centers of activism, education, and innovation, HBCUs have the potential to play that role in addressing climate change and promoting environmental justice. So there's pretty much like a few elements that I want to go over for how they can achieve this. Intersectional curricula being one, research, community engagement, and policy advocacy. So first, as others have mentioned, it is crucial for higher education institutions to develop comprehensive and interdisciplinary curriculum covering various aspects of climate change, especially the sociological aspects of this crisis. The environmental studies program at Howard exposed me to a range of climate and environmental topics through the sociological lens. So this holistic approach to the curriculum allowed me to develop a really deep understanding of the interconnected nature that climate change has on marginalized communities. HBCUs can and should integrate climate change and environmental justice issues into their curricula across disciplines, ensuring that students are well informed about challenges and solutions related to climate change. By equipping students with this knowledge, HBCUs can cultivate a generation of future leaders like me who are prepared to tackle climate change and promote environmental equity simultaneously. So this holistic education allowed me to approach my work today a little differently. So I was able to coin the term environmental liberation, which is a framework for addressing race, climate, and environmental justice issues together through community building, people power, and it draws a lot of inspiration from the radical Black tradition. The curriculum also helped me to advance innovative approaches to environmental movement building, such as the work that my organization does, Sustain the Culture, which aims to shift the cultural narrative about mainstream environmentalism and creating a more inclusive and culturally informed movement that resonates with Black youth. So next, I want to talk about how crucial it is for HBCUs and other higher ed institutions to promote research opportunities that allow students to engage in community and equity-based applications of climate issues and solutions. So during my time at Howard, I was grateful to have the opportunity to work on a research project investigating the environmental justice impacts of gentrification in the Buzzard Point community of Washington, D.C. So this experience not only honed my research skills, but it also allowed me to contribute to the understanding of environmental equity challenges faced by communities of color. I also want to mention the importance of fostering partnerships with community organizations and grass-top leaders. It's really important to have that sort of partnership going on so that students have opportunities to learn about climate solutions from communities that are actually on the front lines, right? Hearing from their lived experience and their expertise. So during my undergrad experience, I engaged with many community members and partners through my research and also through my internships. And that played a huge role in me understanding how grassroots stakeholders are so important in driving climate action. And then just coming full circle to the movement building legacy of HBCUs, these higher education institutions continue today to play a role in movement leadership locally and globally. So for instance, during the anti-apartheid movement, HBCU students, faculty, and administrators organized protests, they held teach-ins, and they engaged in acts of civil disobedience to raise awareness about the injustices of apartheid and to pressure the government to take action. So today, HBCUs must continue to advocate for climate policies that promote environmental justice and the needs of marginalized communities. They can do this by engaging with policymakers, by participating in public discourse, by taking stances, not accepting money from fossil fuel companies. They can help shape climate policy to ensure that it's equitable, inclusive, and effective. So in conclusion, of course, climate justice should be at the forefront for all higher education institutions, but because HBCUs have historically served minority communities, they have a unique relationship and opportunity to address disproportionate impacts of climate change. So as you consider these insights and create your recommendations in a way that includes HBCUs, it's also important to remember that, these institutions and their students need to be adequately and equitably resourced in order to have a greater impact in this work. So I hope that's been helpful.
Very helpful, Ayana. Thank you so much. I look forward to learning more about your environmental liberation and really appreciate your focus on agency for students and some real practical things around environmental equity, environmental justice. So thank you so much. You mentioned resource, so that takes us to panelist 4, Dr. Leah Stokes, who's going to discuss how higher education can take advantage of federal legislation such as the Inflation Reduction Act. So Leah, I'll turn it to you.
Great. Well, it's so wonderful to be here. And thanks to all the other panelists for their really insightful remarks. It's been great to be here. So I'm a professor at UC Santa Barbara. I also work with several environmental groups, including Rewiring America, and I helped to pass the Inflation Reduction Act, which includes a lot of money to help all kinds of people and institutions decarbonize. So I'm going to start with a bit of a story from my backyard in the University of California system. So you may know that the University of California set a carbon neutrality initiative way back in 2013. And the goal is that in just 2 years from now, in 2025, we will be a carbon neutral campus system. And you know, the University of California is a very large public institution with many campuses across the state. The concept is that we would be the first major university to be carbon neutral. This is really exciting. I obviously support the university doing this, and I have lots of colleagues who are on the sort of front lines of figuring out how to make this happen. Yet, I'll also say that as recently as 2022, last year, the campus, my campus, UC Santa Barbara, is still installing fossil fuel infrastructure on campus. I gave a talk where I talked about how, you know, we have to electrify our buildings, and I talked about on-campus faculty housing, which is where the professors often live. And I heard that, including some of my colleagues who work on environmental issues, climate change, energy systems modeling, that they've just moved into houses where they have put in, for example, a gas stove. So even though there is solar on the roof, which is fabulous, they are still installing fossil fuel infrastructure. And this is a decade after this goal of carbon neutrality was set. So I think the first thing to realize is that if we're going to be carbon neutral, if we're going to take on climate change, we have to stop burning fossil fuels. And what does that mean? It means that we have to stop installing fossil fuel infrastructure, because it really is these machines that are in all parts of our life, whether that's the car in our driveway, you know, the furnace in our house or our apartment building, you know, the gas stoves in our kitchen. Every time we put in a new fossil fuel machine, we're locking in carbon pollution, because that machine is going to run on fossil fuels for, in some cases, a decade, in some cases, many decades. So the fact that a university like mine, that is really a leader in so many ways, is still installing fossil fuel infrastructure just shows you how much we can lose the forest for the trees in this climate conversation. So I want to talk about the two things that we have to do in all parts of society, including higher education, to deal with the climate crisis. And that is, we need to use clean electricity. So that's things like wind and solar, right? And we need to pair that with electrification. So we have to use that clean power to run not just the things that already run on electricity, like our lighting, right? But we also have to think about running new things on electricity, whether that's the cars that we're using, the way we're heating and cooling our homes, the way we're cooking dinner. Basically, if we can use 100% clean electricity and then electrify all the machines that we can actually eliminate about 3/4 of current carbon pollution. So there are lots of other important things to focus on, for example, like food waste or reducing the eating of meat, dealing with heavy industry. There are other things to think about. And, you know, often things that students are quite interested in, for example, the food topics, as I was, for example, as an undergrad working on these issues. But it's really important that as institutions that own buildings that, you know, so oftentimes have power plants on our campuses, it is fairly common to have a power plant, like a cogen fossil fuel power plant on our campuses, that we actually think about the fossil fuel infrastructure in our system and what we have the power to do to reduce that use of fossil fuels, and certainly stop installing new ones. And the cool thing is that these things can be done in concert with their students, right? If we're going to install solar panels, or we're going to electrify buildings on campuses, if we're going to do a plan to remove a fossil fuel power plant on campus, students can be part of that. They can be part of the planning, whether it's engineering students, policy students, humanities students. They can learn from these experiences. I remember when I was an undergrad, we actually used a newly passed policy in Ontario, Canada, to put up a solar project. This was back in 2006. And we used that policy that created so much money that it then provided scholarships to students from underprivileged backgrounds to be able to afford to go to the university. So, there's really creative things we can do. And the cool thing is that the Inflation Reduction Act is that same kind of policy that has just passed. The Inflation Reduction Act basically allows us to do things like install solar panels, and get a lot of money back. And there are now ways that nonprofit institutions can do it, even if they don't owe the federal government money. So if you want to get 30%, or in some cases even more, because sometimes there's adders back for cleaning up the electricity system on your campus through, for example, installing solar panels, through the Inflation Reduction Act, that is now something that's basically going to be subsidized by the federal government, whether or not you owe the federal government tax liability. So these are the kinds of programs that can transform our campus's carbon footprint in a really structural way that is sustained and that gets at the heart of the climate crisis. Climate change can feel really overwhelming, right? Both the impacts as well as all the different pollution sources, which is why I really remind people that the problem is fossil fuels. The problem is burning fossil fuels. And the solution to that problem is clean electricity plus electrification. And we now have, particularly on the clean electricity side, a lot of money that can be used by higher education institutions to move much faster on cleaning up the electricity system in our backyards. And what we need to do that is pair that with electrification. There isn't as much money for the electrification side of things, although there is some. But the good news is that often electrification actually saves money, not in every single case, but in many, many states. Moving to a heat pump, for example, doing insulation, improving windows and doors, all of these things can actually pay themselves back and can reduce the cost of operations at the university. So with that, I will finish my remarks. And I just want to say it's really exciting, all the work that folks are doing, because this is exactly the kind of thing that we want to be educating our students so that they can be part of making these transformations. As we just heard with the last panelist, we really want students to be transformational change agents too, who can go out in the world and take the things that they've learned from the campus sort of laboratory or experiment and put that into larger systems, larger institutions across society. And that really is the promise of higher education.
Great. Thank you so much, Leah. Really appreciate your comments. Again, actionable items, very specific, concrete examples, more agency for our students, and certainly more climate action for our campuses. So this is the moment where we have an opportunity to dig deeper with our phenomenal panelists. I'll ask the first question and encourage you to include your questions in the chat so that Millie can call on you to ask your questions. So if I can take us back to panelist one, to Dr. Glendon, and your great foundational presentation, you mentioned that we can use what we know about instability in local areas like Baton Rouge to help us adapt and grow and plan for climate risk. So I'm curious about examples of how higher education can use that data and that information to move this work forward.
Sure, I'm happy to answer that. And I will also try to answer Jay Perman has a question in the chat, and I'll combine the answers to both of those questions.
Great.
One of the challenges that higher ed faces is that higher ed has a teaching staff of specialists, and very few of those specialists consider climate to be in their specialty. And so so one of the things that I think is most needed is a kind of climate literacy for faculty who aren't climate scientists. So I take Ayana, if I can call you by your first name, Ayana, Ayana's example of learning across disciplines. We need some faculty learning. And I'll give some examples. A perfect example of this is one of the most famous climate scientists in the world is at Stanford, a guy named Ken Caldera. I went to see him and I said, I just want to be sure. It seems like civilization depends on a stable climate. And he said, yeah, everybody knows that. And I was like, nobody knows that. Absolutely nobody knows that. Nobody across your campus knows that. It may be the case that a small number of climate scientists know that, but learning that as part of understanding physics, understanding civics, understanding history, anthropology, would really be helpful. But you need those anthropology professors and those history professors to have some of this context. And so one of the arguments we make is that in professional settings, you need some new education for adults. And what's interesting is outside of academia, that's starting to happen. You're building sustainability teams in other companies, and they're getting education. But no faculty are signing up for some new education for the faculty to learn about climate change to bring into their scope. And I think that's really important. And one of the most fascinating things about this is that the kind of learning that needs to be done is more like civics. It's not that they need to learn physics, they need to learn just the relationship with the physical world, regrounding work in the physical world, regrounding the humanities in the physical world, politics in the physical world. And that connection, universities have in some ways encouraged the abstractions of narrow silos that left the physical world out. And so I would argue that there's need for some kind of, sort of internal re-education and upgrading of skills of faculty, not in their own discipline. I'm sure they're good physicists or good sociologists, but bringing climate into their disciplines with an adult education model that most faculty probably don't think they need. But I know I needed, and I actually have a PhD, but it wasn't in this, and I needed it. And the last thing I'd say about that is, I don't think that teaching comes from PhD climate scientists. I think it comes from people engaged on the front lines or in community to bring that together. And I think it's more like 8th grade earth science. And so you could even have like 9th graders teach faculty, hey, I learned this in middle school and I need to bring it into anthropology. And so it may be a countercultural recommendation, but I do think that that's one of the things we're seeing need for in lots of places. So Probable Futures is a climate literacy organization. We have, and it's a nonprofit, we have people coming from industry asking us to teach them about climate science. We don't have anybody from higher ed really asking us to teach faculty about climate science. And I think that could be a great thing to do and a great thing that your organization could champion.
Excellent. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Millie. I think you're on mute, Millie.
Unmute.
There you go.
I thought it was off. Thank you so much to the panelists. It's been so informative. I've learned so much. I know everybody has. I have one question and then get ready because I'm going to the chat to start asking people for their questions. So here I am sitting in Washington, D.C., representing 350 organizations. Elsa's campus is one of them. And as you know, higher education is going through a tough time. They're losing enrollment. States are doing disinvestment. People believe in this, but they don't have the resources, right? So any examples on how do we convince state and federal legislators to support our campuses in what is a crucial time for our country and the world? Wow, there's silence.
Well, the good news is that through the Inflation Reduction Act, there is new money to make this happen. It's not as much as we would have hoped for. I would say that particularly in the K through 12 area, which I'm doing a lot of work on, electrifying schools like K through 12 schools as well, there's even less money and they're even more stressed financially. So at least you have that you don't have it quite as bad as the K through 12 school area. But yeah, I do feel that there has to be a refocus on this. We certainly see this in California, where there isn't a lot of interest in investing in the UC system, even though it has been such a flagship for the state, has been hugely important for the economy. There isn't a lot of interest when they're doing a new school bond. They're not including the UC system within that school bond. So it's possible that we have to do a better job advocating for the importance of universities and for university funding across the board, not just for climate issues. I definitely think that's true. We recently had a big strike in the UC system for graduate students to get fair living wages. And the takeaway there, which I fully supported. And I'm happy with the outcome being more funding for grad students. But the takeaway is that campuses are somehow going to absorb those costs without getting actual additional support. And I don't think that that makes sense. And I'll also say that a lot of what I've been seeing in higher education is not as much funding going towards the core mission of the university, which is teaching, learning, and faculty, and more money going to overhead, bureaucracy, et cetera. And personally, I don't think that that is serving the mission of the university. So, I think that those are some of the trends that we're seeing on the campuses that make it challenging. But for the climate issue and decarbonization specifically, I think that we do have new federal funds towards this. There can be efforts to pass additional money through state legislatures. I think there's a lot of interest in this. Sometimes folks forget, though, when they're setting aside decarbonization money, they maybe set aside for homeowners some money. They set aside some for the utility sector, and they forget to put aside some money for the education system. So that is up to educators and education associations to say, hey, don't forget about us. We actually need funding to help us do the right thing and decarbonize.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
and Millie, if I could add to
Please.
Leah's point, thank you. It is really interesting. If I go out there with an agenda for climate action, for infrastructure, to Leah's point, that's my next, big bear at Eastern, is as we do take care of deferred maintenance and build new buildings, what infrastructure changes am I going to do? And the reason that I'm talking about this is because I hide it. I hide the climate action elements in the ask, or I embed it is a better word. And in that way, I'm able to get the funding. If I just went out there and said, I need to electrify this for this reason, because it's good for the planet, it's good for the state, I don't think I would get the resources that I'm getting now. And that's simply because it's embedded in my thinking, it's embedded in our ask, it's embedded in the way that we are changing the infrastructure.
Thank you, Elsa. Anybody else before I go to Jose Luis, who has a question? Jose Luis, unmute, please, and ask your question.
Thank you. I think my question is related to the one that President Garcia just made, and the responses that we received are very on point. The only other issue I would add is that whenever these earmarks are made for funding, and of course, we're doing everything we can with the resources we have, being strategic, as Elsa mentioned, in the way we present our budgetary ask. But whenever there's significant amounts of money earmarked, particularly at the federal level for these efforts, it is really important for us to figure out how to better advocate for higher ed to be included. So we're looking at, for example, at NAU bus electrification efforts and seeing that there are some roadblocks to get access to those funds. And the reality is that at NAU, and as many of the universities represented by ASCU, we're regional universities, that we're usually the largest employer in town, that have the most to contribute to climate action efforts, and that without the adequate resources, we are actually making a disservice to the communities we serve. In fact, I think at NAU, we're probably more in the public transit business than the public transit companies that serve the region in Flagstaff. So just a point, I guess now with the responses that were given, is less of a question, but just a call to action to figure out how we can make that case that we at universities actually have, in many of the communities that we're trying to serve with this funding, a bigger responsibility than most.
Thank you, Jose Luis. Tati Steelman, I see you have a question. Go ahead and unmute.
Thank you very much. This is for Dr. Nunez. What do you see as the biggest barriers to further progress on your campus? I commend you for all the amazing work you've already done. It's very inspiring. And what are your next level priorities? Thank you.
Yeah, a good question and a tough one to answer. And I think Leah hit it in her presentation, which is the next big bear for me, as I said, is infrastructure. Unless I make significant gains in the next few years in infrastructure, I'll continue to do what I'm doing. And I make progress, but not in the significant ways that we anticipate. That the campuses, the students, the faculty, the staff are quite ambitious in their thinking about our gains. And so as I ask for money for capital, for infrastructure, it's getting more complicated because that adds cost to my ask. And that funding that I need is the biggest barrier right now to change the infrastructure of the entire campus. We have 250 acres. So to go building by building to change the infrastructure is very ambitious, but it's needed. And unless we do that, we're just not going to make the gains that we think we should be making.
Thanks, Elsa. Jay Perman, did we completely answer your question?
Well, if I could, Millie, thank you. I wonder if others on the panel might have some thoughts. I was fascinated and provoked in a good way by Spencer's comment to my question of who's going to do the teaching that our students need, that we need, and his answer is everybody, which I think is a great answer and actually refreshing. But I wonder if anybody else on the panel had perspectives on where this higher education workforce is going to come from to get us caught up.
The only footnote I would add to what Spencer said, because I think he's absolutely right, is that my younger faculty, the new hires, are there already. They have, Spencer, they have that knowledge base. It's the existing faculty, the tenured faculty that need the teaching and learning experience.
Thank you.
I wonder if I could jump in for a moment and add to the question.
Go ahead.
What Elsa just said about generational differences are really important. Although if you have middle school kids, you've been hearing a lot from your own children. But I wanted to follow up on the question to Spencer. I put it in the chat, and it is going to take a lot of learning and just shifting our thinking in new ways within higher ed. And Spencer, you briefly mentioned that other people from other industries have come to Probable Futures to learn. I wonder, what can we take away from other sectors, other industries about how to get this process going and sustaining it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say a couple of things about that. The first is that there are two pitfalls we've seen other industries and other organizations take, which is to become focused exclusively on carbon reduction. And I absolutely agree with Professor Stokes and what she said, but there are not a lot of people on campus can do very many things about carbon reduction themselves. But about resilience, about adaptation, about being aware of the physical world, everybody can participate in that. I'll give a simple example. In the early 2000s, there was a heat wave in France that killed thousands and thousands of people, and the French government developed a heat wave plan. And in last summer, it was similarly, in fact, hotter, and no one died. You ask, well, what was the plan? A lot of it was checking on your neighbors. That was part of the heat plan, was understanding who was around you and checking in on them, understanding that heat was something we all need to deal with in a new way. I give that example as a non-technological change that was good for society, but needed to have a plan for it, needed to have some sort of communication around it. So one of the things that happens in a lot of other industries is that a sort of sustainability ghetto is formed. So what happens is there's a new department, it's the climate people, it's over there. So I think most of us on this call are old enough to remember when the internet was the responsibility of someone called the webmaster. I don't know how many of you remember that term, but organizations had a webmaster, and there was one person whose job was the internet. There are a lot of institutions that are trying to do that to climate, like have a person or a small group of people just take care of it. Now we think the webmaster is silly. We're all engaged in the internet. We need to have sort of informational hygiene and literacy to be citizens. I think that same kind of mindset of like, we're all involved in this, it's part of everything we do, is better at some organizations and then at others. And this brings me to something that was said by all of the speakers, is that it has to involve leadership, that this is a C-suite problem. Whatever your chief is, your chief of whatever, has to internalize this. If it's a small department on the edges, it won't happen. It won't get the message. And then it needs to incorporate younger people. So one of the things I say to prominent CEOs is, if you're making a decision in a room where no one is under 40, you're probably making a bad decision. And so bringing young people into decision-making is a practice that organizations can have. And so the very best organizations we've seen deal with climate change are really concerned with attracting young people. They make it an incentive of the old people to be interested in the young people. And bringing those generations together is a very effective way to do it. So to summarize, having a small department that is not powered doesn't work. Having it not be the chief's problem doesn't work. But if you can knit people together and say, this is more like information and money, we all need to be aware of it, you can wind up with a culture that asks interesting questions about what they could do and how they could help.
Thank you so much. Charity, I see you have a question. Could you unmute?
Yes, I can. Is everyone able to hear me?
Yes.
Great. I have a question. I see that if it's okay if I call you Spencer. I really appreciate
Please.
Your presentation and kind of making this literacy really accessible. I kind of asked my question towards your earlier comment about if I got this correctly, but when we teach climate literacy, that we shouldn't go into it with the mindset that people need like a PhD in it to teach those things. And I asked about traditional ecological knowledge because I'm from Alaska, but so many of Alaska Native people were able to survive in conditions that a lot of, non-Native scientists aren't able to do. But we don't hold PhDs from institutions like Harvard or like Columbia, which is the school I go to right now. I study civil engineering at Columbia, but I guess how can we hold space even for Native people to talk about these type of sciences? And one thing that I always push for is that the way we live off the land is also a type of science, because again, these are things that so many people aren't able to do. And again, I've heard of your work is really amazing. So I'm also thankful to be sharing virtual space with you.
Well, thank you. That's very sweet. And I spent many years hoping to have a conversation like this. And so having it now is really gratifying. So thank you. And I really think that what you just described, so one of the challenges for traditional scientists is that they've been taught to think in Western ways that have been very explanatory. They are very powerful, right? Civil engineering, pretty useful. And yet it's narrow. And so one of the things that we talk a lot about, I find, and Bridget, whom I happen to know well personally, brought this up, if you are talking to children about the physical world, you're in touch with the physical world because it is not abstract to them. Somehow along the way, we distance ourselves from the physical world. And you come from a community where that didn't happen, where the adults didn't think of the physical world as other. No children think of the physical world as other. And I think one of the best things we can do is be connected to the physical world. And so I was asked about how to use this data, just paying better attention to the physical world around. So I'll give you a little secret, which is that when we were building all the probable futures, the password in was pay attention. Just paying attention to the physical world around you is a practice that I think we can all learn from traditional societies, learn from indigenous societies of noting. To me, all trees were trees until I started doing this work. And then I started paying better attention. I just think that can be enriching, motivating. And so bringing those native, non-traditional or non-Western ways of being and thinking, even into civil engineering, makes it more human, more alive. And we can learn from communities that didn't lose touch, didn't make the physical world so abstract. Because one of the most important things that Dr. Nunez said was we stopped maintaining, taking care of. I love the writing of Robin Wall Kimmerer, who asks this question of her students. She's an indigenous teacher of science. What is a good thing we can do for climate? And her kids almost always say, humans are just bad for the environment. But historically, that's not true. We can live with the environment. And that's a native knowledge that I've had to learn, and I'm glad to be sharing. So yes, Daniel Wildcat said, we have built a modern world on insulated ignorance, bringing down some of those walls and just appreciating that we have physical bodies. The most surprising thing to me about climate science is it's all pretty intuitive. It's not like AI. It's not like genetics. I'm never going to understand what a protein really is. But I do understand why a white shirt is reflective and a dark shirt is not, why ice is reflective and the sea is not, why warm air holds more moisture, because I've felt that before. And so activating those kinds of knowledge that are real but weren't in books, I think is a way to be connected in a beautiful way. And so I appreciate your asking the question, and I wish you well in your studies.
Thank you, Spencer. Oh my God, we've had such a great time asking all these questions and learning so very, very much, but we have one more last question at this part of the program. So let me ask, Catherine, I think you had a question for Ayana. Let's close with that question, please.
Wonderful. Thank you. Ayana, your vision and your comments are really inspiring. And I was curious if we could put a magic wand in your hand to help support students on their climate journeys. What would you wave that wand for?
Great question. Great question. So I'd like to echo some of what Dr. Glendon said about, expanding climate literacy, and really weaving it into some of the general education requirements across colleges and departments. I think the reason why I start with that is because I think to support students in their climate journey, and I think I saw your question in the chat, and you said even if they're experiencing climate anxiety and may not be super amped up about taking climate action, we have to meet students where they're at, right? We can't just have just one department that offers this curricula and then we just keep it there. No, we have to, all students are on a climate journey, basically, right? Especially students of color who are probably facing climate justice issues in their hometown. So meeting students where they're at, providing lots of resources for research opportunities, for mentorship, and professional development for wherever their work intersects with climate. That's really important. Just making those, talking more about those intersections and providing opportunities at the business school, in the education school, and throughout the university. I also think for me, just from my personal experience, I was a campus organizer. I organized for sustainability initiatives on my campus. And a big barrier for me was just having to deal with the administration not being super supportive, or not exactly at the time seeing the vision of why certain initiatives were important. So I feel like a campus environment where administrators are supportive and intentional about incorporating the demands and the feedback they're getting from students, it would also be a great change. Because ultimately, if you see your campus as a microcosm of society, modeling changes that can modeling changes for the future that we all need to see, I think that helps alleviate climate anxiety a little bit and makes me feel like my climate action has efficacy.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me turn this over to Kim. Kim, it's yours.
Thank you so much to our panelists. This has really, really been a fantastic conversation. The time has zoomed by very quickly. We're coming to the close of the first listening session of the Higher Education Climate Action Task Force. So we want to thank everyone for joining us for this really important conversation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Millie so that our task force can continue our work.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to the panelists and everybody here. Our next listening session in this series will be on June 28th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll hear from speakers who will highlight higher education's role in developing the clean workforce. Please do register and join us for that. But for now, that is all. The public program has concluded. Thank you.